Well, good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. And when we first started chatting with Oxford County and heard about the future Oxford sustainability plan, I was very much impressed with how the county was really committed to moving forward with a sustainability plan that was so ambitious and frankly fit really nicely with the kinds of things that we're trying to achieve with the Canadian Index of Wellbeing. When they asked me to speak today, one of the things that was emphasized is, position where what we do with the Canadian Index of Wellbeing and how it would fit with the sustainability plan to sort of energize some understanding about the work that's going to be happening here and our partnership with Oxford. And so I very carefully and intentionally decided to title this presentation for you on working collaboratively, because we certainly got that message from the partnership group, the enthusiasm that existed there, and how important it was for cross-sectoral partners from all different parts of the county working in all different areas to work together towards advancing hopefully a really positive, resilient, sustainable future for the county. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the Canadian Index of Wellbeing to get started, just so you understand a little bit about us and how it fits in with the plan. Our mission, we try to do three things, and this will speak to the different goals as well that the sustainability plan has. Obviously, being based at the university and our focus on well-being, we want to do really high caliber research to understand all of those factors that affects people's lives and say something back about that might actually help people and communities to find a better path towards well-being. And that really speaks to the second two parts of our mission, to encourage policymakers and other decision makers to sort of act on a more of a well-being at the core of decision making, at the core of policy development, as a way of moving forward, but also to advocate right at the grassroots level for citizens such as yourselves and the people in Oxford County to have a voice in the direction where this plan may ultimately go. So when people ask us about that, well, how do you actually go about doing it? One of the popular vehicles that we often see in the newspaper is, the quarterly reports on GDP for the country. The last quarter GDP went up in Canada by 0.8%, and I'm sure that you and your neighbors were out dancing in the streets celebrating because your lives were so much better and our social progress towards a new future is defined by GDP. Well, this is really part of a global movement away from GDP as a measure of sustainability, as progress in all the other aspects of our lives. And I'm not dismissing GDP or other economic measures as unimportant, but they're not the only thing that matters to Canadians. So it's flawed if we tend to look at it as being only something, or the only thing we have available to us to actually look at quality of life. The Honorable Monique Bejean recently stepped down as the co-chair of our advisory committee, but she was part of the World Health Organization's Commission on Social Determinants of Health. And I think this statement nicely summarizes both what we try to do, but also the recognition that focusing exclusively on economic measures just doesn't really capture the essence of people's lives if we want to do the best we can to achieve a future that we want. So how do we define well-being? I'm just going to give you a very brief history of how we came about. The Canadian Index of Wellbeing actually got started at the Atkinson Foundation in Toronto, which is a foundation tied to Torstar, that publishes the Toronto Star newspaper. They've had a long-standing commitment to social justice over the years. And back in 1999, one of their board members asked what seemed like a simple question, and it came out of frustration with always focusing on GDP as if it was our measure of social progress. And he basically said, what would it actually take to measure well-being, to really understand what matters to people and understand the things that contributed to the quality of life? That question gave birth to the Canadian Index of Wellbeing. Atkinson put quite a bit of money into initially talking to Canadians. They organized a whole bunch of consultations and focus groups across the entire country with everyday citizens, Aboriginal peoples, as well as experts and others. But basically, they went into these discussions with a simple question. What matters to you? What makes your life good? And from all of those conversations and getting people to tell stories basically about what their lives were like, they were able to pull together those areas that really sort of defined the things that we valued and said, yeah, this is what makes my life good, why it matters to me and to my family. And so that conversation gave rise to this definition for us of well-being, which is really very much informed by citizen opinion. So the presence of the highest possible quality of life that involves each of these 8 things. Good living standards. So this is the acknowledgement that the economy still does matter, but how it actually matters to us in our day-to-day lives. You know, whether or not you have affordable housing, whether or not you're economically secure, whether or not there's food security within your communities and so forth. But also robust health, a sustainable environment, vital communities. Is this a great place to live? Do I feel like I belong here? Is it safe? And so forth. Education and contributing to our quality of life, balanced time use, that work-life balance that we always strive for. High levels of democratic participation, which is really kind of a highlight here in terms of ensuring that people actually have a voice in the direction that the county goes through the sustainability plan, and then certainly access to and participation in a variety of leisure and cultural opportunities. I mean, that last one, being in a leisure studies department at the university, and people say, what's that all about? When we talk about the kinds of things that really contribute to people's well-being and their happiness, you go to a cocktail party and you meet somebody for the first time. What's the first thing you ask them? What do you do? What do they usually talk about? Their work. Next time, ask them what matters to them. You know what they're going to talk about? Their family, their friends, their vacations, their community, the kinds of things that really enrich their lives. And very often that occurs through community vitality, their engagement, through the things that they do in the community, whether it's volunteering or their leisure and culture activities and so forth. So those are the things that really sort of manifest to define our overarching quality of life. And that's what we try to do. So this is our framework. And the way that it's been adapted is that based on those conversations and identifying those 8 core areas, research teams from across the country looked at all of the literature out there and said, okay, here are some indicators, and that's represented by those numbers around each of the domains. Here are some specific indicators that if this is going up or going down, this is the effect it's going to have on our well-being. So in each one of those domains, we have 8 indicators that pertain to those areas that really matter to people. And when we put them all together, we have an index, like GDP, that we can track our progress in all of these things as opposed to just purely the economy. So where does this fit with Oxford's sustainability plan? Well, when we've had these conversations with other partners in the past, a lot of people have invoked, you're very much like a sustainability plan or framework, aren't you? And certainly what we do by trying to capture the broader essence of a community, of a region, or what have you, does touch on things like the environment, the economy, the social conditions, or community as it's defined in this plan. And so we saw the fit as being, very natural for us. So this framework that you've probably seen as part of that larger plan here for Oxford does privilege the economy at the center here in terms of making sure that the living standards, as we would regard it, are at the heart of making sure that development proceeds within the community. But at the community level and the environment, now we're talking as well about the complementary pieces that people point to as defining their quality of life. So how does that map onto what we do? Well, here are the 3 major areas as well as the overarching goals for the plan. All of those goals also have a number of targets associated with them, objectives where they would like to see Oxford move forward to. And when we look at those, they resonate precisely with the kinds of things that we do in the Canadian Index of Wellbeing. So all of the targets and objectives that Oxford has align very nicely with the 8 domains that we have in the CIW's framework as well. So just to give you a little bit of background about how we got here today, and you heard a little bit about the survey that's going to be happening in April. Our first objective when the CIW was getting started throughout the 2000s is that we were working towards actually coming up with this index that would track progress over time in the country and sort of say, here's how well we're doing on things beyond just the economy as reflected in GDP. So we compiled all the data, we tracked it over time, we pulled it into each of the domains, and then created the CIW Index. And when we released this, this is what really garnered a lot of attention and made people realize that if all we do is attend to the economy, we're missing out on all those other things that people really value in their lives. So as you can see from this graph, from the period 1994 to 2010, we're working on our next national report right now, and it shows similar trends. We can see that GDP continually grew over all those years. You can see that dip in 2008 when the recession hit. GDP is beginning to recover. But the main takeaway is look at the gap between GDP growth, a measure of progress, economic only, against how we've been progressing in terms of quality of life. Flatlining through all those prosperous years in the late 90s and early 2000s, starting to grow a bit, but then the recession hit and some of those things we turned away from, and we're not even recovering at a national level in terms of our overall well-being, even though GDP is. We can also look at this in all of the domains, and I'm not suggesting that all the areas are equal in terms of how well we've been doing. You can see that education, as a relatively prosperous, educated populace in the country, we've done quite well in that area. Community vitality is not doing badly, but in areas like the environment, time use, leisure, and culture, we've actually seen declines in those domains since 1994. So we're not attending to the things that really matter to people. And again, I think the Oxford Sustainability Plan is alerting us to, if we want to move forward as a region and a county, let's make sure we attend to all those things so everybody comes along with a more prosperous and resilient region to live in. So we've released these reports now over the years. As I say, the next national report will be in the fall. We've also done one for Ontario that the Ontario Trillium Foundation commissioned from us to see how Ontario compared to the rest of the nation. Now this is particularly important to us as well because many of the policies and legislative acts and everything that actually affect our lives are provincial responsibilities. We might have, for example, the Canada Health Act, but the way health services and healthcare is actually implemented is different within each province. So knowing how provinces compare overall, we can learn from each other, we can see the areas that we have to spend a little bit more time on, and so forth. So as I say, we've also been in Ontario. We did the Ontario report for Trillium, and we found similar results for Ontario as we saw for the nation as a whole. GDP tracked fairly similarly for Ontario in terms of the pattern, but as you can see, towards the late 2000s, and also because of the 2008 recession, it hit harder in Ontario because of the large manufacturing base in part, but we suffered more somewhat from the recession here than some of the rest of the provinces did. But the bottom two lines reflect well-being. And what we see is that Ontarians are probably pretty resilient because they've been able to maintain a level of well-being irrespective of that dip in the economy. So they are responding in a positive way. Observers have suggested that, because in Ontario, we actually see, it's difficult to see, but one of the top lines up there is community vitality. When things got tough, your neighbors stepped up and started to help out within their communities to make sure people got through some of those tougher times. So we were really sort of heartened by seeing, some of these patterns for the province overall. So how does that bring us to the community well-being survey that we're going to be doing here in Oxford County? Well, in the early days when we were producing these reports, we had a number of communities contact us and say, can you do that for us? Can you actually create an indicators report so we can see how our community, how our region is doing relative to the province, relative to the rest of the country? And as it turned out, we can't. And part of it is because of the unavailability of data, like real baseline information that we can access at a local level. We can get it at the national level, we can get it pretty well at the provincial level, but if we wanted to get, right down and say, how are the residents of Ingersoll doing, Woodstock, even Oxford County in its totality, we can't get the data at that level. We just don't have that much information. So what we did is we took the framework, those 8 domains that Canadians have told us really matter to their quality of life, and said, we're going to design a survey so that people can actually put forward their own perceptions of how they're doing in their community. So we've got a questionnaire now that we've used in Victoria, in Kingston, in Waterloo region, in the city of Guelph, and I'll tell you a little bit more about those. We've also been in Fort McMurray, which was a unique experience as well. But basically, all of those projects were driven by, we want that baseline information so that we can identify the areas that are of greatest concern to our citizens to advance well-being meaningfully towards a vision of the future that we can all hang our hats on and move forward with. So the way the Community Wellbeing Survey works, and it will work essentially here in Oxford as well, is that we wanted it to represent all the residents from every corner of the county. So what we do, and we'll be working with Canada Post and identifying a random sample of households from across the entire county. Those households will be sent a letter of invitation to participate in the survey. And the survey will be online, but you can request a paper copy of it as well if that's your preference. It will cover all 8 of those domains, but from the perspectives of the residents. So in community vitality, we ask about volunteering, whether or not you're members of certain groups within the community, your sense of belonging to the community, within democratic engagement, your interest in the being part of the political process, in leisure and culture, the things you do, the access you have to your facilities and so forth. On the environment side, the National Index looks at things like greenhouse gases and ground level ozone and so forth. Well, we're not going to ask you how you feel about today's ground level ozone, but we do ask you about what's the quality of the environment where you live. Do you have a nice community in which to walk around in, like access to green space? What's the, how do you feel about the air and the water quality near where you live? That's how you see the environment affecting your life. But we also want to know, as part of the sustainability plan, the efforts that you're making to sort of give back and support the environment, because it does affect your well-being. So do you reuse? Do you recycle? Do you try to walk or bicycle instead of taking your own car when you have a chore or an errand to run, for example? So those sort of stewardship kinds of things from your own perspective. So it covers a whole spectrum of different issues that relate to your lives. So the survey isn't short, it's really comprehensive, but it really gives us a highly detailed picture of the things that people see and feel about their community, how they feel about Oxford. And it is a really great starting point to see how can we now move forward, because we better understand those areas that people feel are most important to them, where the gaps are, what we need to act on first. Just to give you some examples of where we've been already, we started off with the city of Guelph. Now, each of these examples, we've worked with different partners. With Guelph, we actually worked with the city at that time. And they had a well-being initiative that was being championed by the mayor, Karen Farbridge, at that time, to advance well-being within their community. And we were one part of it, where we did the community well-being survey there and was able to provide them with information to actually start beginning to design strategies and programs and service delivery ideas that would enhance well-being within the city of Guelph. And one of the really interesting things that they did, in terms of ensuring that they got the engagement of the people, was they created these things called design teams. And they invited residents of Guelph to join them. They organized them around each of the 8 domains and said, okay, now you've got all of this information from our survey, as well as the other things that were done, like the Mayor's Town Forum, and they had information cards at different locations for people to offer opinions about the city. They pooled all that together, and they said to the residents who made up these design teams, they said, what would you do? What would you like the city to do to improve that particular area that the team was organized around? So there was a democratic engagement design team, one for the environment, one for leisure and culture. And my colleague Linda McKessick took a phone call one day when they were in the midst of this from the city manager that was overseeing the project. And she was going, we can't control them. They keep talking about things in other domains. They're not sticking to what they were told to do. Perfect. Because the thing we really want to see, and this is where bringing all of these partners from business, not-for-profit, from the city, or rather from the county, bringing all these different sectors and partners together we come up with better solutions. Together we see the intersections of those domains and how they affect our lives. And so the solutions we come up with have a greater impact in all of our lives, as opposed to one problem, one solution. And so what they stumbled on was exactly what we had hoped would happen. Now, you know, the epilogue to this story is that unfortunately the political masters shifted the vote in the last municipal election. Karen Farbridge is no longer the mayor. They have different priorities, so the project is kind of stalled, but you know, they really actually took this to heart and tried to move it forward. We've also worked with some community foundations in different communities like Kingston and Waterloo and Victoria, and because their mission in terms of like providing funding for local initiatives to support quality of life, once again there was this, you know, clear connection there. And so working with them, we were able to actually give them the kind of baseline information that was a little bit more current and a little bit more specific to their community in order to inform their vital signs reports. And you may be familiar with those that the community foundations do. But basically, it's like a report card on the community and how well we're doing in all of these areas. And it does affect the kinds of initiatives and things that the citizens would like to move forward on as well. The last one I'm going to mention to you, and this one is probably most similar to the Oxford example, is that we worked with Wood Buffalo region, principally with the people in Fort McMurray, but also in the outlying communities as well. So, you know, a northern, relatively, you know, remote community. You know, little segue. You know, Fort McMurray, they know they're the poster child for the evil tar sands. They read the papers. But about half the people that live there don't work directly with the oil industry. And they have families, they have lives there. They want the best for, you know, their families and their friends. They have a thriving community there, and they want the best life possible for them as well. And so irrespective of what's going on in the industry, they know they're very much tied to it in terms of their economic future, but they wanted to ensure that everything else came along with it. So actually, Suncor partnered with them, as well as several community organizations and Fort McMurray's municipal government, and they formed a community consortium. And so they brought the perspectives of all the different groups that work there, the people who are concerned about daycare, the food centers there, the arts and culture people, the police services, social services, health services, and so forth. Doesn't that sound like what Oxford County is doing too, trying to pull all those perspectives together? Well, that's what they did, and they said, we want to check in with our community to find out what the hot button issues are. Where do we need to focus our attention to make sure that everybody can move forward? And so when we conducted the survey there and gave them the baseline information, they are now directing their energies through this community consortium to try to improve areas that the residents themselves identified needed some attention. The other piece that came out of it that I found really interesting is that I was doing a talk there after we had conducted the survey to tell them a little bit about themselves, and everybody wanted to know how they compared to everywhere else. And as you can imagine, Fort McMurray was quite a bit different in terms of like access to health services, for example, because of where they were. They were obviously quite concerned about, you know, small local businesses, because everybody's shopping online now because they can get more choice going online, so they wanted to be able to support their community efforts as well. But a couple of things that came out of it that they hadn't anticipated was that there was a real concern about childcare. There was a real concern about those people, because it's an incredibly expensive place to live, that were in the lower income categories that we might feel would be not too bad living here, but there, because of the cost of food and housing and everything else, made it a real challenge for them. You know, so they started to recognize where they needed to focus their attention. And what they had assumed going in was that because of Fort McMurray's reputation, people probably didn't feel that committed to the community. They might have felt that it wasn't a great place to be. And we were able to show them that the residents there are just as proud of their community. They have just as strong a sense of belonging as any of the other communities that we'd been in. So they didn't need to convince their residents that it was a great place. They needed to convince them to get more engaged in the community and see how they can also help out and help their neighbors as well. There was some really interesting cross-sectoral things that happened. You know, I don't have any evidence for this. It was like eavesdropping on conversations. But at one of the sessions I attended, the person that was responsible for arts and culture in the community got talking at a coffee break with the fellow that ran the food banks in Fort McMurray. And they were talking about, what their objectives were and so forth. And the woman from the Arts and Culture group was saying, one of the things that we'd really like to be able to do, and we just don't know how to do it, is start introducing kids, to the value of the arts, the performing arts, the visual arts and so forth, and how it can really enrich their lives and give them a medium, a forum through which they can express themselves as well. We think that's a really important part of early childhood development for their later life. Well, the guy from the food bank says, well, why don't you set up a booth and a program in our food banks? Because we see all the low-income people coming in, and that will give you access to those families that might have the greatest need for that kind of experience. Who would have put those two groups together before they came together in a community consortium to talk about the well-being collectively for everyone that was living there? So the Fort McMurray example, was really great. And so seeing how it's playing out here with the sustainability plan and the partnership group that's formed and people from all different sectors, is a tremendous advantage that Oxford has in ensuring that all voices are heard, but all those things that contribute to our quality of life are on the agenda. So all of these projects that we've had in the various communities have contributed to a whole bunch of different reports that we've provided to each one of the communities. In Kingston, for example, we did a report on civic engagement, like how actively engaged people were in the community, because they wanted to say something just prior to their last municipal election to get the councillors and the candidates for mayor to start talking about the things that concern the people living in that region. And one of the things we were able to show to them is that across the board, without exception, those people that were more actively engaged reported higher levels of well-being, without exception, across the board. We were also able to dispel the myth that younger people, and I look out and I see a lot of younger people here as well, this myth that they're not engaged is just that, it's a myth. They may not go out and vote, but we were able to show that in Kingston anyway, and this is true for the other communities, that younger people are just as actively engaged in their community trying to make change as anybody else. They're just choosing not to vote because they don't see that as the immediate path to change, but they're just as engaged. And that changed the conversation in Kingston. So all of this kind of feedback in terms of understanding the community, understanding the county, for example, will go a long way to making sure the sustainability plan moves forward. Now, whenever we've done this work, this is the inevitable question that comes up. Based on our work, what's the most important domain to focus on? And I've often resisted this because we've been able to show that all of them are important. Every one of them plays a role in contributing to well-being, and that's why it's this comprehensive and why the sustainability plan is expanding beyond just the economy to the community, to the environment, and so forth. So, if you had to guess, which domain do you think most people feel would be most important to the sustainability of Oxford County if we were going to attend to it? Anybody want to guess? Democratic engagement is one guess. Who else? Healthy populations. Yeah, healthy populations, living standards comes up a lot. When we actually look at the data, and this is based on all the surveys we've done across all the communities, here are the two that make the strongest contribution. Now, bear in mind, every one of the domains makes an important contribution to well-being, but these are the two that makes the strongest contribution. Leisure and culture, having access to the kind of free time activities that really enrich our lives, and community vitality, the sense of belonging that people feel to their place. Those are the things that they pointed to say, this is what makes my life good. So this is why it's really important for us not just to focus on single domains and assume it's health, assume it's living standards or what have you, but see this as an integrated model like the sustainability plan for Oxford. Because well-being in Oxford, through the future sustainability plan that you have, if it takes a look at all of these things and integrates these, we know, for example, that focusing on this will in fact contribute to things like the environment, to living standards, community vitality. That's what the plan is setting out to do. But if we see it as a more holistic picture, there are always going to be these implications for other domains as well. If we enhance community vitality, get people more engaged, get them feeling more part of belonging to the community, they'll get involved as volunteers, take part in recreational and cultural activities. They'll meet other people. They'll get more connected. They'll take part in the democratic process more because they feel a part of the community, they have an investment in it. So this is one of the messages that we really try to emphasize with our well-being survey when it's informing a plan like this one, is make sure you see these interconnections, because it gets you away from one problem, one solution, and saying, let's take a look at a problem and see whether or not there's a solution that would actually raise the boat in all of these areas for everyone, not just a single area. And that's what we're really striving to do, and that's why we're really excited to be here working with Oxford, because you get it. You see that as being an important path forward and have a plan in place. And we're really proud to hopefully be a small part of that process. So thanks very much.